Jeremy needs new slippers for kindergarten. I also have to pay the utility bills. And Molly has been begging for a new doll, Mandy thought, calculating her advance payment expenses on the shuttle bus to work. It was payday, and beyond groceries, she had to consider other essential purchases and payments. Money was always desperately short. The children quickly outgrew their clothes, asked for sweets, and her salary as a hardware store saleswoman barely covered their needs. Her ex-husband refused to help, though occasionally he bought fruit or candy, always specifying it was only for his son. Mandy avoided filing for alimony, knowing his lifestyle and fearing he would drain money from the children in his old age. Chuck had never truly worked, despite his teaching degree. He insisted teaching was women's work and refused to wipe schoolchildren's noses. His attitude had roots in his upbringing. His late mother had merely forced him to attend the college to obtain any diploma. Mrs. Miller was a photojournalist, and after Chuck's birth father died, when he was 6, the woman started to go away on business trips abroad. There, Mrs. Miller made good money, showering the child with gifts, indulging his every whim. All this in a try to compensate for her absence and ensure her son's happiness. Besides, after a while, she found there a wealthy widower and got married to him. Chuck didn't want to live abroad, so he stayed in Mother's home. Mandy's mother-in-law maintained a good relationship with her. Knowing her son wouldn't hurry to seek employment, the woman sent monthly money transfers and gifts. She was also the one who insisted they adopt Jeremy. Chuck and Mandy had been childless for 10 years. At first, Mandy felt uncertain about this idea, but her husband, ever obedient to his mother, convinced her to visit the children's home. There, they met a 2-year-old boy from a troubled family. He had enormous sad eyes, didn't speak, and struggled to connect with others, hiding constantly behind the caregivers. After being removed from his good-for-nothing mother's care, Jeremy spent several weeks in the hospital, recovering from severe malnutrition. He grew attached to one of the nurses and suffered deeply when they parted. Though small, he carried the look of an adult who had seen too much of life. Jeremy had lost his trust in adults. Mandy and Chuck visited him every day at the orphanage, brought him presents and went for walks together. Slowly, the boy thawed out, even smiling when he saw his new parents. While immersed in preparing documents, visiting authorities and bonding with Jeremy, Mandy finally released the burden of thoughts about having her own child, who had weighed on her for years. A month after her son moved in with them, she discovered she was pregnant. The happy woman shared the joyful news with her husband and was shocked by his reaction. "Mandy, let's handle this medically before it's too late. We can't afford 2 children at once. Jeremy is already 2 years old and in kindergarten. When the baby comes, you'll have to take maternity leave. We can't live on my mother's help alone. Our apartment is too small, just 2 rooms. Where would we put another child?" "What are you saying? This is our child, so long awaited," Mandy said in disbelief. "And what about Jeremy? Back to the orphanage?" Chuck pressed. "I grew up with just a mother, and I can't imagine how I would have felt if she had another child." "I won't terminate it. Don't even suggest it," Mandy replied tearfully. After this conversation, Chuck rarely came home. He had previously had affairs, which his wife knew about, hoping this phase would eventually pass. She even convinced herself that he loved her deeply, since he always returned home. What mattered most to her was that her husband didn't drink. He might occasionally have some wine, but alcohol made him ill, so she never saw him drunk. This was why Mandy had married him, believing herself fortunate. Her late father had been an alcoholic. When drunk, he would lose all humanity, destroying everything around him and beating anyone in sight, sometimes even little Mandy, who spent most of her childhood hiding under her bed. At first, she prayed her father would stop drinking. Later, she began wishing he would die. These thoughts terrified her, and feeling wicked, she would kneel, begging God's forgiveness. However, her father, 20 years dead, still haunted her dreams, always chasing and trying to catch her. When Molly was born and placed at her mother's breast, screaming loudly, Mandy felt truly needed for the first time in her life. She looked into her little daughter's eyes and realized she no longer needed to win love. For the first time, she was loved simply for existing. Previously, Mandy had always had to seek recognition. As a child, she fawned over her father, afraid of him. She remained obedient and affectionate to please her mother, who disliked her for her resemblance to her drunkard husband and blamed her for ruining her life. As a teenager, she worked tirelessly around the house like a bee, so her strict grandmother, with whom her mother had left her after the divorce, wouldn't send her to boarding school. In marriage, she stayed perpetually poised and beautiful for Chuck to keep him from straying to mistresses. She also tried her best to please her mother-in-law. Then was the struggle to win Jeremy, who, like a wolf cub, resisted accepting his new mum. Mandy was taken from the hospital by her mother-in-law and mother. The presence of the latter surprised her, but over time she noticed how reverently her mother treated her grandchildren. This both pleased and saddened Mandy. While she was glad her children grew up loved by both grandmothers, she never understood why she herself couldn't earn her mother's love. Chuck, during his occasional appearances at home, defiantly ignored Molly and never failed to reproach Mandy for depending on his mother's financial support with 2 children. However, after giving birth to her daughter, Mandy had changed. She no longer tried desperately to keep the family together, finally beginning to respect herself. One day she told her husband he should be ashamed of living off his mother at 37. Though Chuck was hurt, Mandy pressed on. "You've never held a proper job. I'm sick of your wild business schemes. The apartment you live in, I inherited from my grandmother. What do you have? Just monthly allowances from your mother's wealthy husband and rent money from your mother's house? You are nothing. Zero. What about you? No education, no job. Now you're on maternity leave. Tell me, who would want you with 2 kids in tow, except me?" Chuck snapped. "The children need me, and that's what matters most," Mandy replied wearily, meeting his eyes. Chuck shuddered at her gaze. Something had changed in it. She looked at him critically now, not submissively as before. He spun around and stormed out, slamming the door. About a week later, he called, proposing an amicable divorce, saying he'd fallen in love with another woman, younger, childless, and unburdened. Mandy agreed. She no longer feared loneliness, especially since her husband contributed nothing to the household. Her mother-in-law, upon learning of the divorce, promised continued support for her grandchildren and urged Mandy not to rush into finding work, particularly since there was no one to care for tiny Molly. Her mother also helped her several times, but her health prevented her from watching the little ones. A year later, Mrs. Miller passed away, just 1 day shy of her 60th birthday. They couldn't say goodbye, as she was buried abroad. Mandy deeply mourned this wise and kind woman who had supported her for so many years. With no one left to help financially, she had to work. Molly was enrolled in the nursery at Jeremy's kindergarten, and Mandy found work as a saleswoman in a hardware store at the Central Market. She enjoyed her job, had regular customers, and the location was busy, providing a decent salary plus bonuses. The owner was an elderly, good-natured man named Kenneth. 3 months ago, he had hired Mandy a partner, a vivacious, giggly Dahlia, whom she quickly befriended. Dahlia often visited during Mandy's shifts, bringing coffee and offering to cover when needed. Once, Mandy noticed expensive laundry capsules from the store in Dahlia's bag, but assumed she'd bought them elsewhere, where they were cheaper. Rushing from the shuttle bus one morning, Mandy hurried to open the store 5 minutes before schedule. Kenneth had promised to pay advances that morning before leaving to restock supplies. Dahlia was already inside and greeted Mandy with an unusually curt "hello," avoiding eye contact. The owner looked thunderous. He'd conducted an evening audit and discovered significant losses. "Mandy, I understand if you need money, I'll lend it to you. But I can't accept being deceived by someone I trust," Kenneth said. "I don't understand. What's happened?" asked the bewildered woman. "I've noticed shortages after your shifts more than once. I thought they might be mistakes, but here we are again. I won't tolerate theft. Have I ever shortchanged you? I know you're raising children alone, but I have children and grandchildren too. They also need to eat," the shopkeeper admonished. When her eyes met Dahlia's, who immediately looked away, Mandy realized it all at once. "Kenneth, I'm sorry you feel that way about me. I've never stolen a penny from anyone. And I thought that by working for you, for more than a year now, I had earned your trust. Well, let's consider this misunderstanding forgotten. I deducted the shortfall from your advance. Just don't ever do that in the future," the owner said sternly. "How much did you deduct?" Mandy asked, her voice trembling. "Of course your advance doesn't cover the shortfall, but I'll forgive the debt," Kenneth answered calmly. "What? I worked for half a month for free? We won't survive another 2 weeks until payday without any money," Mandy said, horrified. "Look at this. I show mercy and she still complains. Be grateful I didn't call the police. That's it. Get back to work," the owner shouted. "No, you work here yourself. I don't work for free, just to face another shortage at the end of the month," she snapped and stormed out of the store. Mandy knew exactly why those washing capsules had appeared in Dahlia's purse, and why there had been those friendly visits outside her shift. Dahlia was setting her up, but she had no way to prove it. What hurt most was that Kenneth had believed her capable of theft. Mandy felt sick with worry. She had no money left, not even for groceries. She slumped onto a bench and pulled out her phone to browse job listings. A posting for a nurse position for an elderly woman caught her attention immediately. The pay was impressive, 1.5 times what she'd made at the store. Though skeptical it might be a scam, Mandy called the employer's number. A woman answered, introducing herself as the secretary of a Mr. Paul Fulken, and invited her for an immediate interview after providing the address. The address led to a 4-story building, the headquarters of a grocery store chain. Surprised, Mandy went inside and explained her purpose to the guard, who directed her to the 2nd floor. Several people, mostly students, were waiting outside a door marked CEO. After about 30 minutes, Mandy's turn came. She entered to find a handsome, broad-shouldered man in his 40s who greeted her with a warm smile and gestured toward a chair. "Why are you looking for a job as a caregiver?" Mr. Fulken asked warmly. "To be honest, I wasn't specifically looking for a nursing position. I need any job that can provide an income," Mandy answered sincerely. "Do you have a medical degree or relevant experience?" the man continued. "I don't have medical training, but I cared for my bedridden grandmother for several years. I can give injections, handle hygiene care, and assist with feeding," Mandy replied. "Fortunately, Mrs. Addison is fairly independent. She mainly needs supervision due to her heart condition and difficulty getting out of bed. The role involves ensuring she takes her medications on time and providing companionship," the man explained. "If you're interested, I can arrange your arriving immediately. Mrs. Addison is my mother-in-law. We live outside the city, but don't worry about commuting. Our chauffeur will handle that. If you're experiencing financial difficulties, I can offer an advance for the first 5 days, which will be your probationary period." "Thank you for your trust. I won't disappoint you. But may I—" Mandy began, but he gently cut her off. "How old are you?" 34, she answered, noticing his eyebrow rise in surprise. Mandy knew she appeared much younger than her age. "There's a car waiting downstairs," Mr. Falcon said, extending his hand. His handshake was warm and reassuring, both confident and kind. Mandy had never interacted with someone of such wealth and status before, having assumed such people were typically arrogant and cold. The driver, Steve, waited at the building's entrance. The 50-something man chatted with Mandy about her life, mentioning his decade-long service with the businessman's family. "Mr. Falcon seems like a very kind person." Mandy shared her impression of her new employer. "Yes, he is," Steve chuckled. "But wait until you meet his wife." As they drove into the suburbs, Mandy admired the beautiful houses with their wrought iron fences nestled among tall pine trees. They approached a gate that opened automatically, revealing a vast courtyard with manicured lawns and ornamental shrubs. In the distance stood a 2-story mansion that resembled a fairy tale castle. They were met on the doorstep by a pretty, full-figured woman in a kitchen apron who introduced herself as Tilda. Mandy thought she was Mr. Falcon's wife and asked her how her mother was feeling. Tilda looked at the newcomer in surprise and laughed. "No, I'm the housekeeper. Mrs. Falcon will come down later. Come on, I'll pour you some tea. Would you like some?" "I would," Mandy answered cheerfully, realizing that she liked it here very much. They entered the beautiful, spacious kitchen and were about to start the tea party when a disgruntled voice called out, "Where's the caregiver? Tilda, is the nurse here?" Tilda made a funny grimace and replied, "Here she is, Mrs. Falcon. Let's go." They went out into the hall, and Mandy saw the mistress of the house, a woman about her age, but very well groomed, tall, slender, with perfect tanned skin and long black hair that shone like in a shampoo commercial. It was obvious from her face and figure that she had undergone plastic surgery more than once, but the result was stunning. "Hello, my name is Mandy. Mr. Falcon said that you are looking for a caregiver for your mum." "Well, first of all, not my mum, my stepmother. Secondly, I'm the only one who decides whether you'll work here," the landlady replied haughtily. "Don't show up like that again. I can't stand jeans. And what's with the stretchy t-shirt? If you want to work in a decent house, dress properly." "All right, Mrs. Falcon," Mandy said, realizing that her image of the good rich people had shattered into pieces. "As for the stepmother, she lives in the right wing. That's where you'll be. I don't want you to appear in the left wing. No wandering around the house, no being late for work. She has a doctor there now. He will tell you what to do with her," the landlady explained on the way to the stepmother's rooms. She stopped abruptly and handed Mandy a few bills. "Paul said you need an advance for 5 days. Apparently there's nothing to eat. And look, don't spend it all on porridge. Buy yourself some proper clothes," Mrs. Falcon said with a sneer. Mandy took the money and lowered her eyes, realizing that she really needed this job now, so she would have to endure the rich woman's attacks. They entered the room to find an elderly lady sitting in an armchair, with a man in a white coat standing nearby, speaking reproachfully. "Mrs. Addison, how many times must I tell you that if you don't take these medications regularly, your condition will worsen?" "Really? What a surprise, and I was planning to climb Everest tomorrow," the woman replied sarcastically. "You're joking, but if we don't manage your blood pressure, Mr. Falcon will kill me," sighed the doctor. "Don't worry, he won't. Our dear mum will outlive everyone," Mrs. Falcon said angrily, leaving Mandy stunned. "Oh, Angela, my daughter, why did you come here? Were you hoping I was dead?" Mrs. Addison asked with a laugh. "For God's sake, live," Angela shrugged. "I brought you a present from Paul, a new caregiver hired by his favourite son-in-law. What's your name?" "Mandy," she whispered, bewildered by the scene. "That's it. I'm off, Doctor. Tell this one what she should do." The doctor explained to Mandy what medicines the woman should take and left. Mrs. Addison, looking at Mandy with a smirk, said, "You can take it easy. My son-in-law keeps trying to prolong my life, but I don't see the point in it." "Come on, you have to live," Mandy said. "What for? What do you live for?" the woman asked tiredly, and looked at her companion carefully. Mrs. Addison's eyes were dull, like a faded photograph, colourless and sad. She had clearly been beautiful once. It showed in her facial features and well-preserved figure. "I live for my children. They are still small in kindergarten. Children are the meaning of my life," Mandy replied simply. "Children are good, but I don't have any of my own. At first I didn't want them. I was building my career. Then I couldn't find the right father. And when both career and candidate finally aligned, I couldn't conceive any more. Age caught up with me. I raised Angela on my own, but somewhere along the way, I must have failed," said the woman with a sad smile. "My son isn't my biological child either. We adopted him, but I love him very much," shared Mandy. "How interesting. And why adopted? Is your daughter biological?" Mrs. Addison asked with interest. Mandy told her about her life, her childhood, her failed marriage, and her wonderful children. The older woman listened attentively, and for a moment there seemed to be a spark in her eyes. She agreed to take her medication and go for a walk in the yard. They talked for hours. Mrs. Addison had a wonderful sense of humour, and Mandy felt completely at ease with her. Several days passed in this way. During that time, Mandy never encountered the owners of the house again, always slipping quietly into the right wing to visit Mrs. Addison. She learned from the elderly woman's story that she had married Angela's father when she was 40. He was a partner of the company where she worked as an accountant. Their affair ended in a lavish wedding. She was his third wife. From his first marriage, her husband had a son, who now lives abroad and sometimes calls her. From his second marriage came Angela. Her mother was a young woman who married a wealthy man but failed to build a family. She ran away with a young lover, leaving her daughter with her father. Angela's mother spoiled her by periodically appearing in her life. She pretended that she missed her daughter terribly, but in fact she only came to ask Cameron for money. The girl was deeply connected to her mother. She always sensed in advance when she was coming. When I showed up at their house, Angela's mother was terribly angry. She probably planned to return to Cameron, certain that he couldn't resist her beauty. When she learned that her ex-husband had married a 40-year-old woman, she was furious. One day she demanded her daughter back and threatened that Cameron would never see the child again. He was worried, but I persuaded him to let his ex-wife take the girl, knowing it wouldn't last long. Sure enough, a week later, she called and said she had put Angela in a cab and that we should meet her and pay the fare. Cameron nearly lost his mind. A 10-year-old girl travelling alone with strangers. Fortunately, everything turned out all right. The child returned home safe and sound. We didn't see or hear from her mother again for 5 years. Then Cameron crashed his car. After 2 weeks in intensive care, we couldn't save him. I didn't want to live after that. For months, I was in a fog. That's when I lost Angela. Left to her own devices, she got involved with a bad crowd and fell in love with some scoundrel. I only snapped out of my grief when the authorities called to say my stepdaughter had been arrested for participating in a robbery. My attorneys got the case dropped. I began caring for her like a little girl, bringing her to and from school, speaking with her constantly, trying to involve her in her father's business. But she had entirely different interests. She didn't want to study. She just spent hours in front of the mirror dreaming about breast enlargement and nose jobs, always on some diet. Then, out of nowhere, her mother reappeared, having learned that Cameron was gone. She convinced Angela that all of her father's money should go to her, that she should claim the inheritance and live carefree with her mother. But I had inherited the whole business through my husband's will. I helped his eldest son, an intelligent, modest and kind man who had secured a good job abroad, married and had 3 children. I explained to Angela that I wouldn't let her destroy her father's business and squander all his money in a year. After that, everything became unstable. Angela would go to her mother, then return like a beaten dog, start drinking, always demanding money. Once, I was heading to negotiations and took her along to keep her from sneaking off to her mother or dubious friends. That's where she met Paul. She's pretty, and he liked her immediately. I watched in surprise as Angela changed. She became more settled, dated only him, and communicated normally with me. About a year later they married, and I handed over Cameron's business to my son-in-law, seeing what an honest and good man he was. I thought everything would be fine, but Angela hadn't really changed. She had just bided her time to catch a wealthy husband. I know what this troublesome girl is really doing while Paul's away. But that's life, Mandy. Mrs. Addison finished her story and fell silent, gazing into the distance. Yes, the rich also cry, Mandy thought. She had believed that wealthy people were immune to problems. Come now, Mandy, let's not be so gloomy. We've still got life to live, Mrs. Addison said cheerfully, and suggested they get something to eat. We're rebels. We can eat whenever we want, laughed the woman as they headed to the kitchen to find Tilda. On their way, they encountered Angela, wearing bright makeup and trailing expensive perfume. I told you to keep your caregiver out of this part of the house. What's so difficult to understand? She asked angrily. Angela, child, don't get angry or your Botox will shift to one side, Mrs. Addison said with feigned affection. The mistress shot a hateful glance at her stepmother and silently left the house. In the evening, as Mandy was leaving, after saying goodbye to the old woman, she ran into Angela. Are you going home already? She asked, surprisingly peaceful. Yes, it's time. I need to pick up the kids from kindergarten. Listen, what's your name? Oh, never mind. But could you please help me? The woman suddenly asked. Yes, of course, replied the bewildered Mandy. You see, my stepmother is getting worse every day. To make her comfortable, I want to put her in a fine boarding house nearby, but my husband thinks that would offend her. Thus, your job is to support me in this matter and help convince my husband that she is an old lady and needs constant professional medical care, so she belongs in a nursing home, Angela said. In a nursing home? But that's where people live out their lives, Mandy replied, discouraged by this suggestion. I understand. You're worried that you'll be out of work. Let's do this. I'll give you enough money to last you a year, the landlady said irritably. I don't know. Mrs. Addison is in her right mind. Why would she go there? I can't do that. Do you know why you have nothing? Because you're a stupid fool. Angela snapped and walked away. Mandy was troubled by this conversation all evening. She couldn't decide whether to tell Mrs. Addison about Angela's insidious plan or keep silent. In the morning, waking up with a heavy head, she discovered that her son complained about a headache. She called Mrs. Addison to ask about sick leave, and the woman immediately suggested Mandy to bring the children with her. An hour later, they arrived with the children, and Jeremy, upon seeing Mrs. Addison, immediately asked her where the slide or swing were. When told there weren't any, he wrinkled his nose and declared, What's the point of such a big house if there isn't even a swing? The woman laughed and promised to ask her son-in-law to fix this oversight. Little Molly asked the kind aunt's name and, after receiving permission to call her grandmother, pulled a doll from her backpack. This is a present for you, Grandma, so you'll never be sad, she said, holding it out to Mrs. Addison. Delighted by the child's directness, the woman took the doll and, with tears in her eyes, replied that she would never be sad now that she had met such wonderful children. The day passed quickly. Mrs. Addison radiated happiness, surrounded by the cheerful children. Seeing her bright eyes, Mandy couldn't bring herself to mention yesterday's conversation with Angela. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Addison offered Mandy to take the children here again. The elderly woman's joy was evident. She seemed to have found a second youth, and Mandy agreed. The next day, arriving with the children, Mandy encountered Mr. Falcon. "Hello. Glad you brought the kids today. There's a surprise waiting inside. Sorry, but I must run," the businessman said mysteriously, ruffling Jeremy's hair before jumping into his car. The puzzled caregiver entered the house, where an excited Mrs. Addison awaited them. "Thank goodness you're all here. Let me check if the workers have finished. Then I'll call you." They sat on the couch, waiting. Minutes later, she returned, flushed, excited, wearing a warm smile. "Please, follow me," she announced ceremoniously. Outside, they discovered a large playground, complete with slides, a sandbox, swings, and a maze. The children squealed with delight and ran to play. "What a wonderful surprise!" Mandy gasped. "Paul and I spent yesterday choosing this play complex. We even arranged urgent delivery this morning," the elderly woman laughed. "All this for my children?" Mandy asked incredulously, trying to estimate the cost. "No, Mandy, it's not just for them. It's for me too. Your family has brought me more joy in these few days than I've known in years. This is the least I can do," Mrs. Addison replied. Meanwhile, Angela watched from the window as the children played and her stepmother smiled. The morning's arrival of workers installing playground equipment had surprised her, but learning it was for the caregiver's children had left her stunned. Seeing her stepmother's attachment to this servants and her brood, she frantically plotted her removal. The scheme came from Gary, her fitness trainer and secret lover. Thinking of him made Angela tremble. He was devastatingly handsome, and in his arms she lost all control, something no other man had achieved. His plan was simple. Everyone has their price. They would plant a wad full of money in the stepmother's room, install cameras, and wait for the good-for-nothing beggar to take the bait. Initially, the nurse didn't cause Angela any negative feelings. She was focused on morally crushing her stepmother, who had supposedly ruined her fate by taking all her father's money. But when Angela noticed how Mrs. Addison was drawn to Mandy and her children, she realized that removing them from her stepmother's life would help break her down and force her into a nursing home. For years, Angela had yearned for the freedom that her father's mother could provide, but her stepmother had insisted she study and find her vocation. Then came naive, wealthy Paul, who proved easy to win over. Life with him turned out dull. He refused to buy expensive cars, wouldn't let her vacation alone, and constantly talked about giving birth to children. However, throughout their marriage, Angela took countless birth control pills, refusing to become a mother. After an hour of active play at the playground, Mandy and Mrs. Addison finally gathered the happy children into the house for a meal. The women left them in Mrs. Addison's sitting room and went to help Tilda to set the table. The housekeeper was delighted by Mrs. Addison's improved mood. The new caregiver and her energetic children had made her more cheerful and seemingly younger. Meanwhile, the children spotted a purse on the table and decided to buy sweets at the next store. Jeremy told his younger sister everyone would be happy to see the treats they brought. However, the guard at the gate stopped them from leaving and sent them back. The disappointed children returned to find their worried mother and Mrs. Addison searching for them, and they surrendered the purse. At this very time, Angela came down from the second floor, anticipating the next phase of her scheme. She, of course, did not expect that the money would be taken by children, and the guards would be so vigilant, but she had already thought of a way to make a scandal out of it. "Wonderful! Now we're being robbed in our own house," the landlady announced loudly. "Mrs. Falcon, there must be some misunderstanding," Mandy said, flustered. "You're laid off. Don't expect payment. Of course you planned this, bringing your gang of children here to steal from us, Angela said triumphantly. Stop this nonsense, Mrs. Addison snapped, and narrowing her eyes asked, Why was your purse in my room? This is all my house. I can leave my things wherever I want. I didn't realize your dear caregiver had trained her children to steal, the stepdaughter insisted. My children aren't thieves. I didn't teach them such things. They will be punished for taking something without permission, Mandy cried. Take your brood and get out, Angela commanded, pointing to the door while savouring her stepmother's pallor. Just then, Paul entered, reviewing some papers. What's happening here? He asked, taking in the crying caregiver, his furious wife, and his mother-in-law clutching the children. Look at this, Paul. Security footage, Angela said, showing him the video on her phone. Good thing the guards stopped them. Ruined this con artist's clever money-making scheme. Children, why did you take the money? Paul asked, sitting beside the tearful kids. We wanted to buy candy for everyone, Jeremy answered, wiping his tears. Don't do that again. Taking others' things without asking isn't right. Now, come, have lunch together. Did you try new slides? The owner led the children to the dining room, leaving his stunned wife behind. Paul, wait! Their mother taught them to steal from us. I've noticed things missing for days, so I installed a camera and caught them, Angela said, rushing after them and refusing to give up. Angela, please stop inventing stories, her husband said with a sad smile. Well, my dear, now you see why I always told you to study and read books. The theft scheme might be clever, but the execution is sloppy as usual, Mrs. Addison remarked, following the fuming mistress. Angela, pale with rage, spun around and confronted the distressed Mandy. If you think this senile old woman is your ticket to a better life, you're wrong. You should have agreed to help me. Now you'll be thrown out like garbage, you worthless beggar. Mandy, bewildered by this sudden hostility, considered looking for new work, but seeing Mrs. Addison and Mr. Falcon cheerfully offering pancakes for the children helped ease her mind. Mandy, join us for lunch, the owner called to her. After lunch, Mandy was putting them to bed in Mrs. Addison's room when suddenly Paul entered. You'll have to excuse my wife. She can be simply unbearable sometimes. Every day, I don't know what awaits me at home, tragedy or comedy. The man smiled. I so enjoyed talking to your little ones, and my mother-in-law is happy in their company. Thank you for being in our home. Don't pay any attention to Angela, and if she causes any more trouble, come to me. Mandy wanted to tell him about the conversation with the landlady, but she couldn't muster the courage. Paul sat down on the sofa near the sleeping children and said sadly, I have dreamed of children for so many years, but we never succeeded. And now I don't know if I want Angela to become a mother. You are happy. You have wonderful kids. Someone to wake up for every day, to go on, to plan the future. I'm frozen in one moment. Everything is the same. Negotiations, deals. We live for more and more money. But who's the money for? I'd give up everything, but so many people depend on me now. You know, when my mother-in-law called me at 9:30 at night to choose these slides, I was stunned at first. And then we got so carried away. It was like something new. I wish I could have seen the kids' reaction. I felt like spring had come to our house, and everything has come alive. Mandy looked at this big, grown man and wanted to hug him. She decided not to tell him about Angela's proposal, to avoid upsetting him more. Paul stood up, looked into her eyes, and inexplicably took her hand. She held her breath. It seemed he was about to kiss her. The anticipation made her insides tighten, and she stepped forward pliantly. "What are you doing here?" Angela's loud exclamation brought them back to reality. Paul let go of Mandy's hand and silently left the room. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the mistress hissed angrily to Mandy and ran after her husband. The next day, Mandy arrived alone, determined to invite Mrs. Addison to visit them and walk around the city. Entering the house, she met Angela coming down the stairs. "Hey, you don't have to come here anymore. Your ward is gone," laughed the hostess. "She just left." "What do you mean? Gone? What happened?" Mandy's legs weakened at the news. "She went to live somewhere else. Too bad it's not in a cemetery. Don't come here again," the landlady said rudely. "And for trying to seduce my husband, you won't get paid for your work. You and your misbehaving brats have already eaten up 2 of your salaries." Mandy left the house, confused about what to do next and where to find Mrs. Addison. She didn't have Mr. Falcon's phone number, but remembering she had written down his secretary's number before the interview, she called and learned that the businessman had gone abroad on a business trip and wouldn't return for at least a week. When Mandy approached the driver, Steve, she asked where Mrs. Addison might have been taken, and he promised to get information from Angela's personal driver. The next day he called with the address of the nursing home where Mrs. Addison had been taken. Mandy went there immediately and, after speaking with the doctor, received permission to visit. When she entered the room, she saw a woman sitting by the window and called out softly. The woman turned, and a familiar light shone in her faded eyes. "Mandy, how did you find me?" she asked shyly, trying to conceal her joy. "Enough resting here. I need your help. I've been offered a job, and I have no one to leave my children with," Mandy said cheerfully, beginning to gather Mrs. Addison's things. They walked out into the street, leaving behind a grey building that smelled of the oppressive calm of fading lives. The children greeted Mrs. Addison with joy, but Mandy's mother, who was looking after her grandchildren, pressed her lips together unhappily when she saw how reverently her daughter spoke to this stranger. Several days passed. Mandy rushed to her new work, while Mrs. Addison got sleepy Jeremy and Molly ready for kindergarten. "How strange it is to feel part of a family of complete strangers," she thought involuntarily. When Paul returned from his business trip, he got into his car, hoping to see Mandy and her children. He had been thinking about her all week, catching himself imagining how different his life could be with someone like her. In the trunk were packages, a large transformer robot for Jeremy and a talking doll for Molly. He frowned, anticipating the conversation with his wife. The decision was clear. He needed to divorce Angela, while providing for her needs. Love had long since vanished. Her feisty character and arrogance towards others had become unbearable. The final straw was finding the pill box she had carelessly left in the bathroom. When Paul asked her about the medication and learned they were birth control pills, everything became clear. He decided to leave her the city apartment and her late father's business. Remembering the half-empty apartment needed furnishing, Paul instructed the driver to head into town to check it first. Upon reaching his floor, he opened the door and heard a woman's laughter. Bewildered, he walked toward the bedroom and found his wife with another man. Angela, upon seeing her husband in the doorway, nearly fainted with fear, her mind racing. Her lover tried hiding under the blanket, screaming hysterically. "Well, well," Paul muttered, turning toward the exit, surprised by his own composure. He felt relieved. Now he wouldn't need to explain himself to his wife. "Why are you lying there, you fool? Go after him!" Angela struck Gary sharply. "Why?" squeaked the frightened man. "We need to end this once and for all," she declared, leaping from the bed. "Are you insane? He'll kill us both," Gary whimpered. "Get it together, you coward. Stop whining. We must stop him, or we'll lose everything," Angela snapped, hastily dressing. Hit him hard on the head, and we'll figure out the rest later." "With what? No, I can't do this," sobbed the lover, frantically dressing while planning his escape, terrified that her husband might be waiting outside. He must have gone for a gun, the fitness trainer thought suddenly, dissolving into tears over his unfortunate choice in mistresses. After all, their sports centre had other wealthy clients, older and less beautiful, perhaps, but with far less dangerous husbands. Angela glared at the sobbing Gary, fighting an urge to throw a vase at him. Realizing this beautiful coward would never do a dirty job for her, she decided to call her husband and attempt reconciliation. Paul answered immediately, his voice steady. "Angela, you'll keep the apartment and receive a fair settlement. This is goodbye. The driver will deliver your belongings this evening." "Paul, what are you saying? Let me explain. You've misunderstood everything," she stammered. "Don't call again. Goodbye," he replied and hung up. Furious, she tried calling back, but found herself blocked. "Fine. We'll see how you miss me in a few days," Angela thought, studying herself in the mirror. At home, Paul learned from Tilda that Angela had placed Mrs. Addison in a nursing home, but Mandy had taken her in. After getting the address, he went to her home, where her mother-in-law answered the door. "Please, no questions yet," the man smiled. Mandy hurried home after shopping. When she opened the door, she found what seemed like a dream standing there. Surprised, she dropped her groceries, and Paul, noticing eggs leaking from the bag, said with mock disappointment, "Well, what are we going to have for dinner now? Let's go to my place. I should have eggs in the fridge." He embraced Mandy and kissed her. She kissed him back. They stood in the doorway, lost in their kiss, until Molly's voice broke in. "What are you doing here?" "We're cleaning," her mother answered, grabbing the wet bag in confusion. "Is this how Uncle Paul helps you clean?" the puzzled little girl persisted, making the adults laugh. A year later, Paul and Mrs. Addison were chasing after Jeremy and Molly, who refused to pose for the photographer in the maternity ward, while the newborn boy awoke in his mother's arms, demanding attention with loud cries.